Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start chapter 10 now, and we're going to talk about the muscular system as a whole and how it's able to do work. So now we're going to look at things, we're going to kind of go back more to the macro level, right? The last chapter was really at the microscopic level, looking at what was happening in each of these individual muscle fibers. And now we're going to go back out and look at what happens in these muscles as a whole, when they contract, how does that do work, and then how can we group the different ways in which muscles can do work. And then we're going to talk a little bit about like how we name muscles and their origins and insertions and things like that. So we're going to kind of put it all together here. So first, let's talk about, again, the different types of muscles that we have. We've got skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Now, this chapter is going to primarily focus on skeletal muscle and look at how our skeletal muscles interact to actually bring about movement, okay, to actually do some real work. And then we're going to talk, again, like I talked about, the criteria for naming muscles, and then we're going to talk about the principles of leverage. And I just put some nice funny pictures for you. For those of you that know Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course, you have to just include those pictures in any muscle chapter. So when we talk about muscles and their interactions, please remember that muscles can only pull, never push. So I put that again in bold, underline it. Muscles can only pull. So when we talk about muscles, contracting, that muscle is shortening and pulling another bone, okay? And so when we say what one muscle group does, another group undoes. So what we mean here is, for example, the biceps brachii, right? When that contracts, it's going to cause flexion of the forearm, okay? And then when this muscle relaxes, the biceps brachii muscle relaxes, the triceps are then going to contract. And the triceps, as this muscle contracts and shortens, right, it's going to pull the forearm back out and extend it, okay? So again, what one muscle group does, another undoes. So again, the biceps brachii are responsible for flexion, but the triceps are actually responsible for extension. Okay, so again, you have this kind of alternating actions of muscles. So muscles oftentimes work in pairs, but again, they can only pull, they can't push. So we're going to talk about we're going to categorize these functional groups of muscles by what they do. So again, when you're talking about any one action, so for example, we're talking about flexion of the forearm here. We're going to have a prime mover, or what we call the agonist muscle. And that's going to be the one that's responsible for the majority of that movement, okay? So in this case, if you're talking about flexion of the forearm, again, your biceps brachii are going to be your prime mover. Now you're going to have other muscles that are going to help out, things like the brachioradialis and things like that. But your prime mover is going to be the biceps brachii. Now, the antagonist muscle is going to be the muscle that opposes or reverses that movement. So in this case, right, your triceps brachii are going to be the one that opposes flexion of the forearm, because the triceps brachii is responsible for extension of the forearm, and it's the main muscle for that, okay? So this all depends, whatever the prime mover or agonist is, and then the antagonist, depends on what type of action you're talking about. So for example, if you're talking about flexion of the forearm, the prime mover is the biceps brachii, and the antagonist is the triceps, okay? But if you're talking about extension of the forearm, Then the triceps brachii becomes the prime mover, and the biceps brachii becomes the antagonist. So again, this is specific to whatever specific type of movement you're talking about, okay? So again, the prime mover and the antagonist are usually located on opposite sides of the joint across from which they act, okay? That's kind of usually a good clue. And so again, this is just, are you pulling my leg? This is just to remind you again that muscle contraction is all about pulling, okay? So again, those muscles have to, again, shorten to pull. And this is just, again, showing you that muscles, again, oftentimes work in pairs where you have, again, the agonist and antagonist, okay? So there are a couple other muscle interactions. We do have muscles that are called synergists that actually help your kind of prime movers along. So these are muscles that, again, are going to kind of support that whatever that movement is. So for example, again, if you're talking about something like flexion of the forearm here, so in flexion of the forearm, you have your biceps brachii and then also your brachialis. Those are kind of like your big prime movers, right? That are causing your flexion of the forearm. Brachioradialis is going to be kind of your support synergist muscle, okay? It's going to help out the prime mover. It's not the main muscle, but it's going to help it out, okay? It'll help out that movement. So our synergists really like just help add extra force to that same movement. Usually reduces kind of some undesirable or unnecessary movements in a different direction as well. And then our fixator muscle is usually a synergist that kind of immobilizes that joint, basically. So here, our deltoid, in this case, is our fixator, and it really helps stabilize the arm, especially the upper arm here, okay? So it really helps stabilize that arm. And then, of course, your triceps brachii is your antagonist muscle here. So again, those are just kind of some terms that we use for these different types of muscle interactions. Now here you can see in this is actually opposing muscle groups, so that you can see these opposing muscle groups. You're basically your agonist and your antagonist muscle groups. So I just thought I'd show you. It's always nice to see some in the legs. We're talking about the upper arms mainly, but you can see the quadriceps and the hamstring muscles and muscle groups, because you're going to find out there's just more than one muscle in these groups. So they're muscle groups, are again going to do opposing actions. So that just kind of gives you an idea of these different types of actions. And also usually a muscle that crosses across the anterior side of a joint, just as this is more honestly for lab, but just as kind of a heads up, anytime a muscle crosses the anterior side of a joint, it's oftentimes going to produce flexion. So in this case, the pectoralis major, okay, is going to actually, because it crosses the anterior portion of the shoulder joint here, so it's actually going to cause flexion of the arm. Remember here, this is going to be really important that you remember flexion of the forearm here would be if you were lifting this part of your forearm up. But flexion of the arm is going to be moving that humerus in an anterior direction, okay? So just as kind of a reminder, this will help you out a lot with lab, because as you learn these muscles and you learn their origin and insertion, then these types of hints will really help you in terms of figuring out what that muscle action is. So a muscle that's going to cross on the posterior side now, okay, so something like your latissimus dorsi muscle, which is actually the antagonist of the pectoralis majors muscle. So this muscle is going to cause extension because it's crossing again on the posterior side of that joint. So that's going to cause extension of the arm, okay? Or again, moving that humerus in a posterior direction. A muscle that's going to cross on the lateral side of a joint, so something like the deltoids here are crossing on the lateral side of that shoulder joint, is going to cause abduction. You can picture that as this muscle again contracts. You can picture again that muscle shortening and pulling the humerus up and away from the body. That's abduction, right? And then a muscle that crosses on the medial side, which is going to be your teres major, which is going to be your antagonist, of course, to your deltoid, is going to cause adduction. Okay? So remember, adduction is where you're adding that limb back to the body, okay? So again, you are bringing that limb back into the body, adding it. That's why I like to call it adduction, okay? So again, here you've got your antagonist muscle groups. So here you've got the deltoid fibers that are causing abduction, pulling the arm out, and then the teres major group causing adduction, pulling that arm back in, okay? So again, you can see the same muscles can be in one instance, the prime mover, okay? And then in a different movement, it can be the antagonist. And then in a different movement, it can be the synergist. So it just kind of depends on, again, what the action is and what that muscle's role is. And so we talked about lots of cases where, you know, in one case, like here, you know, you've got the biceps brachii being the agonist muscle, okay? And then the triceps being the antagonist, and then it flip-flops, right? And that was for, that's for flexion of the forearm, and then it flip-flops for extension. So for extension, then the triceps brachii becomes the agonist, and now the bicep brachii becomes the antagonist. So again, this flip-flops, right? The same muscle, same exact muscle, can, again, have these different roles depending upon what the action is. So when we name skeletal muscles, and this is, again, going to be really helpful for you for lab. So these are things that you really want to think about, because with the lab practical for this is usually a typically tough lab practical for most students, because memorizing the muscle, the origin, and the insertion, the action is really tough. But if you know the origin and you know the insertion, a lot of times you know the action of the muscle, and we'll talk about how you do that. And then also naming the actual muscle itself, often there are hints in the name of the muscle, sometimes to its origin, sometimes to its insertion, sometimes to the shape of what it looks like. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So when we talk about naming a muscle, sometimes we name that muscle after its location, okay, where it is in the body. So for example, the temporalis muscle is actually going to be over, you can see, the temporal bone. So that's why we name it the temporalis muscle. So it's that's an easy one to remember where it is located, okay? And so here you can see it's actually going to attach to the mandible. And this is when it contracts, okay, it's going to cause elevation, if you can picture that, of the jaw, of the mandible. Okay, so when it's relaxed, again, you've got depression of the mandible, and you've got opposing muscle groups, of course, that are going to cause that. But then when it contracts, the temporalis contracts, again, it's going to cause elevation of the mandible. Okay. Just kind of a review of some of those actions. And then also, so the other thing that you'll see in muscle locations is things like when you talk about the quadricep muscles, you're going to have things like your vastus medialis and your vastus lateralis. And so you're like, oh, which is which? Well, it's easy if you know the name, right? Because the vastus lateralis is going to be most lateral, so more on the outside of your quadricep muscles. And then the vastus medialis is going to be the most medial, okay, towards the midline. So again, those are just little hints of things that are really going to help you out in terms of remembering the names to these muscles. Also, the muscle shape. So some muscles have very distinctive shapes, like the deltoid muscle, okay, or the trapezius muscle, which looks like a trapezoid. Deltoid looks like a triangle, big triangle here. So those are things that can help you remember, again, names. Muscle size. So things like your gluteus maximus tells you it's the largest of all the gluteal muscles. And then the gluteus minimus is the smallest of all the gluteal muscles. There are many gluteal muscles, but again, this will help you to remember that, again, maximus is the largest and minimus is the smallest. And again, oftentimes we only have you a lot of times know the maximus and the minimus or one or the other. Oops, sorry about that. And then you'll also see we have the terms longus and brevis. And I'm so sorry, I don't have brevis written down here. Brevis is short. But let me go ahead and add that in here. So you see the term brevis, B-R-E-V-I-S, is the term that means short. So you may want to add that in there. It may be because I believe that you don't have to know the brevis muscles for most of them. I'm trying to think about it. Yeah, I think actually now that I think about it, you probably only have to know the longest, but just so you know, there is a brevis. Just especially as you take future courses, obviously many of you are going to be moving on in the health professional, in the health professional courses. So just for your own purpose, there is a brevis and the brevis is short. So a lot of times, for the most part, we only have you know the longest, but there is a brevis. If there's a longest, there's a brevis. Because that's obviously why we have that. If there's a name longest, then we're comparing it to a shorter muscle. Okay, so let me go ahead and, sorry, sometimes once I enter the writing mode, then I can't advance my slides there. Okay, so the other thing that we'll use in terms of naming skeletal muscles is the direction of the actual muscle fibers or muscle fascicles. Remember those muscle bundles? So oftentimes if those muscle fibers or fascicles are running all in one direction, then we can name them after that. So this is most prominent with the abdominal muscles. So for example, when you talk about things like the rectus abdominis, rectus means the fibers are gonna run straight. So they're gonna run straight up and down. So here's your rectus abdominis. And then transversus typically means that they're going to run perpendicular, okay, or at a right angle to. So here you can see this is your transversus abdominis. And again, these muscle fibers are running directly perpendicular to your rectus abdominis that are running up and down. And then oftentimes we have the obliques, which are actually going to run at an oblique angle, right? And so these fibers will run at angles to that kind of imaginary axis right here. And you'll see here are your internal and your external obliques. And what's interesting is that your internal and external obliques are actually running kind of crisscross from each other. If you look at the fibers, they actually kind of make an X. So just for you for lab purposes, this is not for lecture, but for lab purposes, your external obliques, picture they're the hands in the pocket muscles. So if you're putting your hands in your pocket at an angle here, those are your external obliques. And so then that will help you as you learn these muscles. Then your internal obliques are in the opposite direction. So that will help you just to know the direction of those fibers to help you remember, again, little tricks to the trade like hands in the pocket muscles. So again, external obliques, again, this is just for lab. External obliques, hands in the pocket. Internal obliques, again, are going to be kind of crisscross in the opposite direction. Also, we'll name muscles off of their number of origins. So if you look at the biceps brachii, again, of course, they're going to have 2 origins, which is actually going to be the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula, as well as the coracoid process of the scapula here. So again, oftentimes we'll name them after, if they have 2 origins, biceps brachii. As you can probably guess now, triceps brachii has 3 origins, okay? So that'll kind of give you a heads up on how to name some of those types of muscles. And then also, again, I know you don't have to memorize all of the, origins and insertion points for each muscle group, but it is good to know things like if you have a muscle that has 2 origin points, it is good to know those 2 origin points. Or, something like the triceps that has 3 origin points. Again, just for future reference. Location of attachments. So again, sometimes they're named according to their point of origin. Sometimes they're named according to their point of insertion. And so I don't think that we've talked much about origin and insertion yet, but origin is going to be basically the bone that is not being moved. That's going to kind of stay in the fixed position with contraction of that muscle. And then the insertion point will be inserting to whatever bone is actually going to be moved by contraction of that muscle. Okay. So some examples of this, and I'll talk about that again as we kind of get towards the end of this lecture. But an example of this is a great muscle, and a lot of people don't like this muscle, sternocleidomastoid, but I like it because it tells you the origin and insertion for this muscle. So the sternocleidomastoid, if you turn your neck to one side, you can feel, this is that big muscle that like runs at an angle, okay? From your sternum and your clavicle, okay? All the way, its points of origin there, all the way to its point of attachment, which is on the mastoid process, okay? So again, it's going to insert on that mastoid process, and you can picture it's easier to picture what again that muscle is going to do as you contract and pull the head down towards that one side. So if you can picture that, I wish I had my video on, and I'll probably do a video of some of these muscles for lab and their actions, but play around with this so that you can feel some of these muscles on yourself. Also, again. Oh, I meant to actually put this in another section. This was, sorry, not supposed to be here. This, I already mentioned vastus medialis and vastus lateralis in terms of the actual muscle location where it's located. So it's just in a wrong spot there. And then muscle action, sometimes the muscles are actually just named after the action that they do. So if it's a flexor muscle, so again, you have things like your flexor carpi radialis. And so that's a muscle that's going to like flex the hand. And it's going to be on the radial side, which is nice. So it's radialis. So it tells you a lot about what it does. And those are always nice because, and carpi again is going to kind of mean your carpal's hands. So you can think flexor carpi means it flexes the hand. Extensor carpi means it extends the hand. So again, those are kind of cool muscles to remember. Like again, extensor carpi radialis, or again, extensor carpi radialis longus, which means that's the longer of the muscles. I just kind of talked about this when we talk about origin and insertion. And again, remember that when skeletal muscles contract, they are pulling on bones that they're attached to. So the origin is going to be the bone that does not move, okay? And then the insertion is going to be the movable bone. So again, the bone that is actually being moved. So in this case, when you're talking about the biceps brachii, right? The origin, again, is going to be this supraglenoid tubercle, and then also the coracoid process here of the scapula. And then the insertion, so again, the scapula, okay, is not being moved. So again, both those points, the supraglenoid tubercle and the coracoid process, are on the scapula, and the scapula is not being moved. The insertion is actually on the radial tuberosity of the radius, okay? And so that bone is being moved as this muscle contracts. And so there's your insertion point, okay? And then the fleshy portion of the muscle in between the origin and insertion is also, this is called the belly. I've kind of already used that term, but that's called the belly of the muscle. Kind of the point in between the tendons here. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about how muscles actually do work. And so most skeletal muscles are going to be moving using leverage. And leverage is, you guys probably are all ultimately familiar with levers. If you've ever done something like a seesaw or used a pair of scissors, you're familiar with levers without necessarily knowing about it. So let's talk about kind of the components of a lever system, which is kind of what you're seeing here, okay? So when we talk about a lever system, we're talking about, again, we have this rigid structure. In our case, we're going to be talking about a bone that's going to move around a fixed point that we're going to call a fulcrum, which again, in the human body is going to be a joint. So the lever is going to be acted upon by two forces, okay? It's going to be acted upon by the effort and the load, okay? So what's the effort and the load? The effort is simply just the force that's applied to a lever to move a load, okay? Or move what they call resistance or move a load. So this is going to be supplied by our muscle contraction, right? Our muscle contraction is going to be the effort. And the load or resistance is going to be basically the weight of the bone and the tissues that we're trying to move, okay? So in the case, again, of trying to move the radius in the forearm, right? If you're flexing, again, the biceps brachii and trying to move the forearm, right? Then the load is going to be the weight of the bone and the tissues and anything that you might be holding. Let's say you're holding a book, okay? The weight of all that, of basically your forearm, your hand, and again, the book that needs to be moved when you're doing flexion there, okay? So that's what the load is. And so when we talk about leverage is this mechanical advantage that we can gain by using, again, a lever. And it's largely responsible for our muscle strength, okay? The ability of muscles to be able to move heavy loads. And it's also responsible for the speed of the muscle and the range of motion, okay? Now, again, that leverage, what we get for that muscle is going to be dependent upon the type of lever system that we have. And so whether or not we get more muscle strength, okay, or whether or not we get more range of motion and speed, okay, is going to be dependent upon the type of lever system that we have. But we usually, again, are going to kind of get one or the other. We're usually going to get muscle strength, like lots of muscle strength, or we're going to get lots of range of motion and speed, okay? Or again, somewhere in between, but you're not going to get, lots of muscle strength and lots of range of motion and lots of speed, okay? All at the same time out of that same muscle. And we'll talk about because again, we're going to have these different lever systems upon which our muscles are built on. Now, when we're going to talk a little bit about the terms mechanical advantage and mechanical disadvantage, which is funny because there's really no disadvantage in the human body. This is really just talking about your kind of ability to move a force or again, move a load. And the muscle whose attachment is farther, okay, from the joint will produce the most force. And that's because the effort, right, which is going to be our muscle contraction, our effort, okay, that's farthest from our joint here, okay, our fulcrum or the joint right here, is going to be able to produce the most strength, produce the most force, right? And so you kind of intuitively know this if you've ever used a lever. And the muscle attaching closer to the joint, so let's say again, if your effort, you were pushing down here instead, okay, is going to have a greater range of motion and a faster speed. But again, it's not going to produce the most force, okay? And so, which is fine because there's really, again, no disadvantage for us. This is kind of considered at a disadvantage when you're talking about levers. But for us, in terms of, and mechanical advantage, but for us, it's not always about, when we contract muscles, it's not always about producing the most force. Sometimes it's about getting a greater range of motion. And again, fast muscle contraction. So let's talk about this again. So again, levers are going to allow us to give basically different effort to move heavier loads or move a load farther or faster. But it's all going to depend on the position of the fulcrum relative to the load and effort. And this is going to make more sense in just a minute when I talk about these different types of levers. So again, we consider mechanical advantage our power levers, okay? So if we have mechanical advantage, this means that our load is going to be really close to our fulcrum or our joint. And the effort, again, which is going to be our muscle that's contracting, is going to be far from the fulcrum. And so this is going to allow us to move a larger load, a heavier load, okay? Now, mechanical disadvantage is what we call a speed lever. So it's funny because we consider this, you know, again, in the world of physics, a disadvantage, a mechanical disadvantage. But in terms of the human body, again, remember that there really is no disadvantage because now this muscle is contracting for different purposes. So in this case, the load is going to be far from the fulcrum and the effort, okay? So again, the effort is that muscle that's contracting is going to be close to the fulcrum. And so what's going to happen is the load's going to move rapidly, right? Because the effort's close to that fulcrum. And it can move it over large distances. So it's going to give it a wider range of motion. It'll move more rapidly. But again, it can't move as large of a load, okay? So it's a little less powerful. So this is the speed lever, and this is the power lever, okay? So again, you can kind of see this here. Here's your example of mechanical advantage and mechanical disadvantage. And so again, that effort here is far from the fulcrum. And so again, you know, you're going to get more force out of that. But here, if the effort is closer to the fulcrum, again, you know, this will happen faster and you can get more range of motion out of this movement. However, you're not going to be able to lift as heavy of a load, okay, as you would here. Okay? So just, again, different purposes. And so this is showing you this exact same thing. So here's mechanical advantage, and then here's mechanical disadvantage. Again, showing you again the effort and the fulcrum here are, you know, far away from each other. Here, the fulcrum and the effort are closer to each other. So there's your mechanical disadvantage with your speed lever. Okay. So let's make a little bit more sense out of this and talk about these different classes of levers and what their purpose is. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this here, and then I'm going to start this in the next lecture for you. And that way then I'll try to keep these a little bit shorter.